welcome you to another edition of Being Well Informed. My name is Claudia Barber. I am the host of this podcast and YouTube presentation where we study relevant topics of interest to the community, and today is no exception. We are going to cover the topic of church succession plans, and we have a wonderful guest in the person of Erika Cole. How are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year to everyone. Thanks for having me on your show, Judge Barber.
Oh, wonderful. Glad to see you because we have kind of shared over the years this whole church attorney, church law arena. And you, in particular, have really taken it by storm. I am just so happy with the work that has evolved in your um, in your field, in your career. And I'm going to start right there and ask you to tell us about yourself.
Well, thank you so much again. Thanks for having me. And it's really interesting just how God has His plans, and thankfully He works it in us. He allows us to be an active part of the great His greatness, and allows us to play a role on the earth. So again, my name is Erika Cole. I'm known as the church attorney. I am grateful that God has given me over 24 years of legal experience, specifically representing churches and faith-based organizations. I was raised in the church. I call myself a pew baby. My parents raised me and my brother in the church, and my mom, in fact, was my Sunday school teacher, and my dad was the head trustee. And I came to know the Lord at a very young age. As a teenager, went away to college, and knew that I wanted to go to law school. Went straight to law school from there, and was selected to be a clerk for the chief judge of the highest court in Maryland. You know that, Judge Barber. So that was Chief Judge Bell. Who's now retired, but that it was a pivotal experience because a case came before the court involving a local church and a national denomination. And that was my first foray to know that there was even this intersection between my faith, which was so important to me, which is so important to me, and the law. I knew in sixth grade that I wanted to be a lawyer. And so God just really called me not only to be an attorney, but to be an attorney who serves churches, who specifically serves faith-based organizations. And Judge Barber, I have to say to you, you also played a pivotal role, because when I was still in law school, you allowed me to work in your law practice, and I got to see a woman of faith up front, close and personal, who was both strong in the faith and an amazing professional. And so I thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You have really transformed this whole field of church attorney law and have covered many areas. It's not just the incorporation of churches, but it's dealing with church succession plans and dealing with other matters such as mental health for pastors. So tell us a little bit about your work in church succession plans.
Well, it's important. I actually feel that we need to be prepared as the body for succession plans really now more than ever. If you're following any of these statistics, if you're not a person of faith, it can seem a bit grim, because what we see is that the attendance at churches are going down. Church attendance is going down, and it has been for some years. But COVID has thrown a whole new curveball, I think, for many churches and church leaders. So we have fewer people attending church as a nation. We have lower giving in general because of lower attendance in our churches. And we also have an aging church population, aging church leaders. The number of people who are going into the, I'm calling profession in air quotes, of the pastorate is significantly lower than those people who are exiting. So as you can imagine, that leaves a crunch. So what we're experiencing is more churches are closing than churches are opening. I mean,
Mm.
those are the very grim statistics. So succession planning is really critical, because if we want to have success continue, it requires succession.
This topic became an interest again because I did want to definitely bring you on the program to talk about this very topic of church succession plans. But actually, in our Sunday school class, we studied the book of Judges. Now, many of you who know about the book of Judges, there are a lot of judges that were discussed. Their narrative, their whole history is there. And in the ninth chapter, however, we got into the story of uh, Gideon's successor, Abimelech, who again was uh, a, a a child from Gideon, who was renamed Jerubbaal. But the matter is that he approached this topic of becoming a successor. And what we also found out, not only did he approach this topic of becoming a successor by asking his relatives, but he also um, was given that opportunity and ended up slaying his 70 brothers. So this is all because he simply asked. And that was the order of business. But and of course, the story, if you read more into the ninth chapter of Judges, you find out that how easy it is for people to assume a role, and it's a bad idea. It's just a
Yeah.
bad idea, and it's not what God ordained.
Yeah.
So move us more into church succession and how you found it to be an important um, opportunity to help churches.
Yeah. Well, that's a powerful story from the book of Judges. I love and have a growing love for the word of God, because there is nothing missing in the word of God. And it talks about how there's nothing new under the sun. So I'm so thankful that God provides us with his word, with the Holy Ghost that lives in us, right? And that he gives us wisdom for each day. I actually want to answer this question by pointing you, if I may, and your listeners, to a podcast episode. I am the host of the Church Law Podcast, which is on the Christianity Today podcast network. And I actually had the opportunity to interview a very powerful pastor was um, who was very effective in transitioning his ministry to a new successor. And I don't know if it's best to mention a name, or I'll just point you to the podcast. But the podcast is specifically on succession planning and why every church needs one.
Mm. Every
That's the
church,
podcast. Every church needs one,
every church.
and so it's on the Church Law Podcast. And Judge Barbara, I can provide you with that link
Hmm.
if that would be helpful. But I will tell you how I see it from a legal standpoint. And I'll also share a couple of tidbits from this pastor from his standpoint. So, from a legal standpoint, in order for anything to survive long term, right? Even if we live for a long time, let's just pretend we live for 100 years, right? Most people don't, but let's just say you live for 100 years. The nature of a legal entity is that it's meant to exist until it's dissolved. So it's meant to exist in perpetuity. There are plenty of American businesses. That's why the stock market is so strong, is because these businesses are established and they're meant to go on forever. Ford plans to be around forever. It's been around for a long time. It will be around for a long time. I was at a firm that had almost 100 years it's existed, and that firm has leaders. I was a equity partner at that firm, and the intention is for it to go on and on and on and on. And for anything to last, you have to plan for it to last. A part of planning for it to last is having a succession plan.
Hmm.
So when I raised this question to the pastor that was on my podcast, why don't more churches do this? Why don't more pastors put something in place like a succession plan? And honestly, you've probably seen this, Judge Barber, in your practice. It's almost like planning an estate plan, making a will. A lot
Hmm.
of people don't want to do it because they feel like if they do it, it means that somehow it means they're going to pass away. The
Hmm.
truth is, we're all going to pass away, but either you're going to pass away and you're going to have a great plan, or you're going to pass away and you're going to leave a mess behind. And it's the same with succession planning. If you want to, the way that you can solidify your strong leadership is that you plan for continuity of the ministry.
That's so important. It is not only an important element of continuity in a church, and I would imagine, though, some churches have secret succession plans. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I will say this, as I teach my children, there is a difference between privacy and secrecy. Usually, secrecy is not good, right? So we talk about secret organizations and other kinds of secrecy. When somebody tells you, I want you to keep a secret, that's not normally good. Privacy, right, is important because that is a part of making sure that there are healthy boundaries for operation. So when I've helped churches in the past with establishing a succession plan, you want to make sure that the people who need to know are aware, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you bulletin every place in the world to let them know what the plan is, because the plan will be unfolded at the appropriate time. But it's very distinguished, I think, between having a secret plan that almost gives the sense in my mind that you're withholding information. No, we want to create information. We want to make sure that we have a clear process. We want to make sure that the people who need to know how to operate the process know how to do so. And people who need to know at a later time can be informed at a later time.
Well, then there's the whole concept of the story of actually King David, and how the eldest in his family, after Absalom was killed, uh, he thought he was going to be the successor to King David. And Bathsheba told David, no, that's not how it's supposed to go down.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not get it twisted. It's Solomon.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And
we've
so
seen this
you
in the
see this
church.
struggle. You see this
Yeah.
struggle here.
Yes, we've seen this in the church. People who you may be self-appointed successors, right? Where there is the absence of a clear process, and then someone steps into that vacuum, and that creates chaos. So, again, nothing new under the sun. This still happens. And the best way to prevent this for your church is to make sure that you have a clear written plan, a clear written succession plan, that those in leadership that need to effectuate the plan to carry it out in your absence are prepared to do so.
Does the type of organization structure matter?
Mhm. Well, it does, because as we know, there are different types of churches, right? So you have some denominations that are often connectional, type of churches. So within that, often those churches have what's called a book of discipline, and the book of discipline will outline, usually someone from the denomination will appoint a new individual, a new pastor to come and serve at that local church. On the other hand, you may have some other churches that are independent churches. And so within that independent church, there may not be an existing process. So you, as the local church, need to make sure that you establish it. And I always say either you establish a process or you identify a person. So if you already know who that person is, you want to make sure that you document that. And don't make it a surprise to either the person or the congregation. You want to
Mm,
start grooming the congregation to understand that this leadership is going to be in place, and that it has your blessing, and that it will be well received, because that's how you make a transition. Unfortunately, we saw within our own country what happens when you have a leader who doesn't move on when it's time to move on, right? It created chaos. So
Mhm.
we had, the whole um, January 6th hearings that just got concluded in our country.
Mhm.
So if you're listening from within the United States, you're probably familiar with that. So the transition, the clear, the appropriate, and the calm transition of power is a sign of a strong nation, and it's
Mhm.
also the sign of a strong church.
So it's very similar sometimes, because oftentimes when you have presidencies and transition of power, this really is a transition of leadership when you're
No, it
talking
really
about church
is.
church
Yeah,
succession plans.
absolutely. And I think that, from what I've seen, sometimes you have, um, pastors, and this again, I encourage people to listen to that podcast episode because I think he said it so well from a pastoral standpoint. I think we all have to know when, as this old commercial used to say when, right? It's important for each of us to know when we have concluded a season, because Ecclesiastes talks about in everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the nations.
Hmm.
So I will give myself as an example. I turned the big 5-0, and I was so grateful that it felt very clear to me that I had completed this portion of my season where I was the doer, right? I was doing all the work. I was, sort of in the trenches with it. And I felt like God clearly spoke to me and transitioned me over time to move from that to now training others. So now I train other attorneys. It's called the Church Attorney Masterclass. So I have a masterclass where I train other attorneys on how to assist churches using this legal audit process that I created. Right. So
Hmm.
I created a proprietary system, and I train others in this system. And so moving from being within the billable hour system to doing more of the training other attorneys and training church leaders. So it's okay for the season to change. Not only is it okay, it is such a commendation for a pastor to be able to recognize that he has been such a strong leader, and that he is able to then go ahead and allow the church to move on while he continues to serve in whatever new role that God has created for him. So I think sometimes I have seen that pastors hold on for so long, it chokes the church as opposed to allowing the church to live under a new vision.
Well, we know when pastors are aging, and they're aging, and it's the 70s, and then it's the 80s, and then for some the 90s, and my founding pastor, Bishop Apostle Emeritus Leroy Kennedy Sr., he hit his 100. God blessed him to see 100 this year in 2022. And so we celebrated until we were just excited and so thrilled. But to the extent that his life and his leadership and his legacy is kind of tied up into this, what resources are out there that will instruct pastors and apostles and bishops on creating an effective church succession plan?
Yeah, so I've written on this, and I think that there may be other resources. I'm open to hearing what you have to share here as well. But I do point you to the Church Law podcast. There's really good information there, free information through the podcast. I have also written some very helpful tools at erikacole.com. Go to my resources section, and I have some very helpful tools there. I have three guides that are helpful. One is related to maintaining the church's exempt status, which touches on some succession areas. My most recent publication is related to church mergers. And while the merger may not be specifically what you have in mind, but I talk about how churches can have successful continuity. A third option I want to mention is I have a series of live webinars that I would encourage you to sign up for. There is um, a discount if you sign up for each of the courses as a package. But there's one in January, one in February, one in March. Again, those details are at erikacole.com. And I'll really help you make sure that you have a good foundation, because you can't even create a succession plan without making sure that all of your other foundational documents and operations are in place. So I really encourage you to make that a priority in this first quarter of the new year.
How can trustees play or serve a useful purpose in the church succession planning?
I think that's a critical question. And I will say that over my years of service, and I tried to calculate, Judge Barber, like how many hours I've worked on church matters, and sometimes it sort of feels like the Book of Revelation, right? Like a number no man can number. Like that's what it feels like a little bit. But I came up with a number like at least 20,000 hours, right? I can
Wow.
safely say at least 20,000 hours. And in all of this time that I've had the grace to provide legal services to churches, one of the comments that I got often is that we really need training for our church board of trustees. Like, these are wonderful people who love God and we appreciate their service. But I often find that churches have shared with me that their trustees just aren't really prepared to know what is expected of them and how to meet their fiduciary duties. You'll appreciate that that term, Claudia, because you know that that is what the law outlines for those leaders. So I actually have a training in February. So again, go to erikacole.com. That is specifically to train church trustees. And it is really a seminal role, because the law considers you the people who are in the decision making seat, right? We know that from a faith perspective, God gives pastors the vision for the church. The law considers the trustees those people, their name comes from being entrusted with the resources of the church. And
Right.
so it's really important that they are in place to recognize what is expected of them and to help the church to have that ongoing functionality. And so the trustees, it should be in the place where they feel confident to identify the succession process and to be able to effectuate that process, to be able to carry it out.
Well, sometimes in many churches, people just join and they have no clue who's the trustee. And in some instances, after because oftentimes it's about people coming to Christ and
Yes, of course.
repenting and serving God, and they're more into other aspects of the ministry as opposed to who's the trustee, and how
Sure.
how many do you have, and so on and so forth. But those things happen and they matter.
Well, they do, and I think honestly, Judge Barter, this is why I have served churches in the way that I have, and I imagine that's also your motivation, right? My motivation is to be able to handle these legal, tax, and logistical matters so that churches can focus on their kingdom purpose. I don't have a call to, at least I haven't heard a call to serve as a pastor, but I absolutely have a call to serve, to use my legal skills to be of service to churches. And so I'm happy to stay in my lane and focus on this way of service. But I recognize that if churches don't take up the focus, or at least to have to bring in the resources, like someone such as myself or someone such as you, then the issues compound themselves. And those kinds of issues, like an IRS audit, or like a tax sale of the property,
Mhm.
or like issues of not having a succession plan, they take on a life of their own, and they
They do.
become an incredible distraction to a ministry if you don't prepare in advance.
Now, I saw some very interesting webinars on your website. One had to do with the avoiding an IRS audit. Is that coming up?
Yep, that's coming up. So that's going to be on January 20th. And I tell people, if you register and just so happen that date doesn't work for you, go ahead and register. You'll get the replay. But I'm really excited that actually on January 2nd, I'm going to have a fellow IRS agent, a former IRS agent, and a fellow attorney who's going to join me talking about just some of the things that trigger a legal audit. And that's going to be a lead in to my upcoming webinar series. So January 20th, we're going to be talking about the how your church can avoid a legal audit. Because again, you want to make sure that you have these foundational structures in place so that you can focus on your kingdom purpose. And as you mentioned, then I have in February, the February webinar, and again, it's a 1 hour webinar, so it's not going to take too much of your time,
Mhm.
is going to focus on church trustees and really how to help make sure that your church trustees are trained. Most of the time, church trustees have never had any formal training. Is that also your experience,
That's
Judge
true.
Barber?
That's true.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, that they are relying heavily on, the what the attorney is sharing with them. And oftentimes attorneys for churches, they're not there every week or every month, only on emergency, something has happened basis. And oftentimes you have that situation, because I mean, I still practice church law, but it's and the topics vary. It could be a software licensing agreement, intellectual property a matter, and again, the housing allowance, and receiving a letter from the IRS. All of those issues come up, and many people believe that churches are rarely audited. What are your thoughts there?
Well, the reality is that it's sort of like individuals. Like the statistics may suggest that it's less likely to be audited, but if you are audited, you're going to be you're going to want to have had preparation, let's say it that way, or at least you want to make sure that your church knows what to do to not be the church that's audited. So you want to make sure that you have your ducks in a row to try to avoid the triggers for audits. And I will also say, there has been a focus, I'm sure you know this, and people who are watching the news, there's been a focus on hiring IRS agents on that upper tier.
Hmm.
So to be able to identify some of these issues with churches. So I don't think that we should rest on our laurels and assume that it's not a problem. I think it's best to be prepared because that's the way to make sure as best you can, it really isn't a problem.
Well, hopefully, church succession plans should be in people's thoughts, and
Yes.
their check their to-do list, just like people should be preparing a last will and testament. It's that important. But the going I guess going back to the whole concept of the trustees, it's very helpful, I guess, to have educated trustees.
Absolutely, because one, it's a protection to the trustees themselves. I feel so bad for these trustees that sometimes things happen and they end up being named as litigants. They end up being named in court documents. And they're just thinking, hey, I'm just trying to be helpful. But if you don't know what your responsibilities are as a fiduciary, and it can be not only harmful to the church, but it can certainly be harmful to that individual as well. So I really encourage every trustee to do his or her own due diligence to be prepared to serve in that role, and every church to um, be to extend the courtesy to your trustees if you're going to ask them to be in this generally volunteer position, to at least provide them with the tools to serve in that position. And that sort of transitions me to the March webinar. So it's a 3 webinar series, one in January, one in February, one in March. And the one in March is the top 4 ways to make sure your church stays out of court. And there has
Excellent.
been, well, it's this is what I have found, Judge Barber, over the years. There's actually really good um, information that's been tracked over probably the past 20 years or so of the top causes that get churches sued. And you will be surprised, number one, what those top things are. And number two, how important succession is. Planning for it, having a good succession plan is to a church to help ensure that you remain protected in terms of your internal operations. So I think that you will be well served in taking advantage of these webinars that will start in January.
You know, you also mentioned the concept of church litigation and how when you clerked for Chief Judge Bell, there was a church lawsuit. There actually have been lawsuits over church succession plans and
Yes.
who's going to be the next pastor.
Yes.
Those lawsuits actually have happened.
Well, not only have they happened, as you know, obviously from your service on the bench, lawsuits, and this is what I always say to my clients, litigation is not cheap and it's not quick. So there are several cases that I can readily point to, having direct information about, I'll say it that way, in the DC area. And the litigation has gone on for years. I mean, years. It's not like you go to court one day and you have a resolution and it's over the next day. No, it can be in multiple jurisdictions. It can be in multiple courts. It can, generally speaking, you're going to be talking about not cost in the tens of thousands, probably at least in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and depend upon how long these things drag out, in the millions of dollars. So if you consider the relative small cost in preparing a succession plan now to the extreme expense and harm that can be done to a church, and when I say harm, I'm talking about litigation, I'm talking about church splits, I'm talking about harm to relationships. These are all things that you can help your church avoid now. I think you're on mute, Judge Barber.
I am. There I am. You have really said a lot and been very um, insightful, given us insightful information here today. And I must invite you back again at a later time to
I
share
would
with
love
us
to.
more. Thank you again. Have a wonderful week. And I appreciate you so much for stopping by on our program today. How can we reach you?
So I'm best reached at erikacole.com. That's ERIKACOLE.com.
Thank you.
My pleasure.